Welcome to the Teamwork Advantage podcast with Greg Gregory. Join us as Greg interviews powerful thought leaders and successful team and leadership experts from across the country on teamwork, leadership, and organizational culture. Now let's check in for this week's episode.
Welcome to the Teamwork Advantage, a podcast dedicated to the growth, development, and advancement of teams, leaders, and cultures, or what I like to call the TLC of business. Hi, my name is Greg Gregory, certified speaking professional, founder of TeamsRock.com and the Teamwork Advantage podcast. Every week, we help you with ideas and strategies that you can use in the workplace or at home to communicate more effectively with your team members. And those team members can be either in your church, your synagogue, your HOA, or in your normal workplace. So let's have a little bit of fun. Let's sit back, and enjoy the conversation today with a gentleman by the name of Doug Rabold. Now, Doug's a second-time guest joining us here on the podcast. We're excited to have Doug joining us because when Doug joins us here, we never know the direction it's going to go. It's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of energy, and I promise you this, Doug's got a lot of information for us. Give you a little background on Doug. If you're not familiar with his background, he is a committed IT leader who has had direct oversight with more than a half a dozen different IT processes in his 13-year IT career. He's led teams of 350 people, managed contracts and assets valued over $60 million. Doug successfully transformed from sales. That's not a normal move, you might think, from sales to IT back in 2009. He's a lifelong learner. He attended the University of Illinois, holds numerous IT industry certifications. Doug is an HDI certified instructor with over 10 years of experience. He's currently serving as the president of HDI, National Board of Directors, on the Strategic Advisory Council for the ITAM Forum. He previously served on the Sharewell Customer Advisory Board, helping guide development from the customer's perspective. Doug's also been named AOTMP IT Management Professional of the Year in 2021. He was a finalist in HDI Best Service and Support Manager of the Year in the same year and selected as People's Choice winner for the 2018 Manager of the Year. He's also recently been named as a 2022 Top 25 Influencer with IT Service Management and Customer Experience. Doug's all about customer experience, customer satisfaction, and employee growth and development. Despite being self-professed as a process guy, he's a committed servant leader and most proud ability to grow and develop talent at every level of the organization. Welcome back, Doug Rabold.
Thanks for having me back, Greg.
We're excited about this. Yeah. And always excited to have somebody. I don't know, you and I've known each other for almost 10 years now, going to and from the HDI conferences and working with that. Things have changed over the years. There's no doubt the pandemic has brought about a lot. And today we're just going to kind of get into something. And something I recently learned, you came out and just told everybody and revealed the fact that you have ASD, or commonly referred to as Asperger's. Why did you come out now? And is it something new?
Yeah, great question, Greg, and appreciate you having me back. And you're right, we often range all over the topics when you and I talk, so appreciate you having me back. So yes, I did recently reveal, just this month, in fact, that I do have Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD. Originally, I was diagnosed in the early 2000s with what was then known as Asperger's. It's no longer called Asperger's. That's no longer a clinical classification. It's been moved into the ASD arena. But the reason of why now is, I've found that of late, a lot of people that have ASD or Autism Spectrum Disorder have begun to reveal that fact. And, one of the things that I've felt is that for, probably the last 20 years since I first was diagnosed with Asperger's at the time, I've kind of lived in the neurodiverse or neurodiverse closet, if you will. And one of the things that that I feel I'm at that stage in my career at is that I don't want others to feel that they need to remain in that closet. And to that point, you know, we're in an era today when DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are firmly rooted in just about every corporate culture, at least with any company that I'd want to be associated with. And hopefully that most of you and most people would want to be associated with. And so when it comes to DEI initiatives, I think one of the things we need to focus on is that isn't just race, creed, color, religion, and all of the, you know, gender-based things. It also has to do with neurodiversity. And so, you know, one of the things that I hope to accomplish by my revelation this month during April, Autism Acceptance Month, is truly acceptance, so that those who, like me, may have been, you know, in essence, in the closet, feel empowered, feel enabled to come out and actually, you know, be who they are.
Now, you've known about this in your life for several years, am I right?
About 20 years, yeah.
About 20 years. So back in your sales career, you knew that you were on the spectrum, and then you still transitioned. So let's talk about that transition for a minute. Was that harder or easier knowing what you know now?
So I it's a great question, Greg, and I would say it probably made that transition easier for me. And the reason being, one of the things that is an aspect of my neurodivergence is that that I have this ability to hyper focus on things, and so I'm also very process oriented, as you mentioned in my bio. And so I always looked at sales as a process. A lot of people in the sales industry believe in the flavor of the day. You know, whatever earns me the biggest commission is what I'm going to sell. I never looked at it that way. I always looked at people come for two reasons. People come to a sales interaction for two reasons. They either come because they're trying to avoid some pain that they're feeling right now, or they come to approach some kind of pleasure that they hope to enjoy in the future. So it was either of those two things is why people buy things. So my process is in essence kind of interview them, ask a lot of open-ended questions, identify what their need is, what is their current situation, what is the need. Do I have a solution that will fulfill that need, and then provide the solution if I do? And frankly, if not, and this drove some of my sales managers crazy when I was in a sales career, I'd tell them where they could find that need. You know, if that meant referring them to a competitor, I would do so, because it earned me a lot of respect. And what happened is, you know, in my sales career, I earned a lot of future business by taking that approach. When I transitioned to IT, I really kind of took it from that same perspective. I applied the same process.
Let's be clear about one thing here. I want to make sure we address this. You didn't just leave sales and go into IT management. Tell everybody where you started in IT.
Yeah, so there was actually there was actually a transition phase. And it's interesting the way that happened. I actually had to teach myself how to migrate data from one system to another as part of a sales project that I was leading at one point. And that was sort of my baptism by fire in IT. And I always had an interest in technology. And after that, I was like, well, yeah, I can do this. And so I did. But yeah, I really, upon making that transition, I really just applied that same process. You're only really interacting with a customer when you're in IT, usually because there's a problem. And so it was identify the problem, use the troubleshooting steps to identify what the challenges are, and then provide the solution. So it was, for me, that approach made that transition much easier, I think, than some may have found it.
Yeah. Now, you used the term a moment ago called hyperfocus. I'm assuming that ability to hyperfocus helped you in part of the transition, being able to make the move over and to solve problems. Am I on the right path there or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the aspects of my neurodivergency is that that I do have that ability to hyperfocus. When it comes to when it comes to anything, what I tend to do is just devour an entire subject. I'm a learner by nature. I love learning things, and I love learning things inside and out, which is an aspect of people with ASD, is they tend to have these topics that are just all consuming. And what I've always done throughout my life, and it's been, frankly, I majored in 5 different things in college because I would go in, I would want to learn everything about something, and then I would switch into something else because once I learned everything, it's like, what's the point in getting a degree in it? But let's figure out something else I'm interested in.
That sounds like you had a lot of squirrels.
Yeah. And it wasn't even squirrels, because squirrels is usually, it's just like I start focusing on something and then I just immediately move to something else.
That's me.
That's not my my typical neurodiversity. What I do is I have to learn everything end to end. And as soon as I learn everything end to end, at that point, it's like, well, okay, now let's move on to the next thing. So it is a little bit different than the squirrel's approach. But that's really the way that I've done it throughout my career. And even, like I said, even going back to college, I always like learning everything I can about something and then moving on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's that hyper focus from a long-term perspective, which is that focus items aspect. But then there's also, sort of a day-to-day hyper focus, which is a little bit different. And day-to-day hyper focus is once you home in on something that you're working on, you just want to, you want to ride it all the way to the end.
Now that can be good and bad, right?
It can be, yeah.
You and I've talked about this before. Working from home in a pandemic situation, okay, that can be a plus and a minus on so many different levels. I would assume the hyper focus was really a benefit to you working from home. Am I right?
So from a work perspective, it was absolutely a benefit, because I didn't have the interruptions. If there was something I was working on, I could easily work it end to end without interruptions, without without a specific meeting on my calendar that I had to get up and walk halfway across campus to get to, and all those interruptions. So in the work from home world, it absolutely allowed me to focus in, because I could budget my own time to focus in on what I wanted to, when I wanted to, and work it end to end. But the downside to that is, in the work from home world, it also took me away from my family more, because I would get focused in on something and want to work it to its conclusion, to the exclusion of all else. And so, there were times that my wife would, find me sitting in the same place without having gotten up to eat, or, even go to the restroom for, 12 hours. I sure as heck finished what I was working on, but, to the expense of, it was like there was no one else in the house. It was just me. And, that was my office. And so, there were times that she'd come over and she'd actually like put her hand in front of my laptop and she'd be like, "You need to eat," and make me get up and go sit down with her and eat lunch.
Yeah, okay, so good. She was a good teammate helping you on that. So
she was, yes.
So let's look at it for this aspect: leading people with a neurodivergency. How do you identify what are things you can do? How is it different? How is it similar to leading someone who may not necessarily be on the spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I'm often asked, now. I haven't been over the course of my career because nobody knew.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knew that I was ASD. But I'm often asked now, what are the things that that make you identify as neurodivergent or ASD, because you don't seem like you are. You seem like a normal guy.
And the key thing is the word is the spectrum, and that spectrum is a very wide spectrum, and so much of it comes from TV and film, like Rain Man or whatever. So that's extreme. So I'm sorry, I interrupt you, but I'm just really curious where you're going with this.
Yeah, and so when I've been led, when people have been leading me, they had no idea. And so what they would do is they would recognize my strengths. The good leaders would recognize my strengths and leverage them. My strengths are, hyper focus, being able to focus on one task and just knock it out of the park, probably quicker than anybody else would. Being, in essence, having almost encyclopedic knowledge of a variety of topics, because they were those topics that at one point or another in my career I devoured. And so, they had no idea that why those were my strengths. They just knew that they were my strengths. And so what I've done throughout my career is emulated those leaders who I found to be most effective. And those are the ones who identified people's strengths. There were, I had, I hesitate to use the word leaders here. I had managers who would try to fix the things that weren't good about Doug. Let's make Doug an Excel guru because, we need Doug to do pivot tables. Really? I'm a director. Do you need me to do pivot tables? Is that the best use of Doug's time? Right. And so, there are things that, that difference between leaders and managers. Leaders find your strengths and leverage them. Managers try to fix the things that they feel are broken. And so I've always led by that respect. So, do I look for, things that are neurodivergent? Do I look for people like me? No. In fact, I look for a diversity on my team. And then what I do is I try to find those various strengths on different people's, in different people's abilities and capabilities and core competencies that will lend to a successful team.
And really what you have just described is no different than a leader should be doing across the board. Because as you mentioned earlier, some of your best leaders, they had no idea. And so they identified your strengths, be able to build to those strengths. I assume the same thing works in motivation. I assume the same thing works in delegation, all the way across the board. So let's talk a little bit now, because April is Autism Acceptance Month. Okay, so we're right there. Were you concerned? I mean, you've had a great deal of success. And like I said, you and I have known each other for 10 years. I did not know that you were neurodivergent in that aspect. Was there a concern about approaching it today and coming out when you've come out and just explained to everybody about this? Was there a concern on your behalf from a career standpoint?
I would say it's probably taken me 20 years because of that concern. But, Greg, here's where I am now. And I've said this about my involvement with HDI, which you mentioned in my bio. I'm at that stage of my career where it's time to give back. Rather than being concerned about myself and what the possible implications are, I would much rather be a role model and model the behaviors and the courage that I want everyone to have. And so to me, it's important right now to come out of the closet, if you will, as ASD, and talk about neurodivergency, because I don't want people to live in the shadows or live in fear that, they've got a diagnosis of ASD today and feel that it could harm their careers. I'm so unconcerned about the potential fallout that, to me, it's much more important that I model model what I would want someone to have done for me 20 years ago.
And that's so powerful, because with everything going on in the world today, coming out and admitting this, it shows your ability to be vulnerable, which makes you, I believe, a stronger leader across the board. And when it comes down to all of that. So with some neurodivergencies, there are pros and cons to this pandemic recently. Okay. Can you address some of that with different people on the spectrum? There are some people who just have absolutely thrived, like your hyperfocus, in this pandemic, yet while others who may be more social based, if you will, tend to struggle. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, great. Again, a great question, Greg. The key here, and you touched on it just a little while ago, is that ASD is probably the most important word in autism spectrum disorder is spectrum. And so there's a wide variety of ways that it manifests. And you touched on some of the stereotypes too. The stereotypes are Rain Man and Sheldon and, all these characters that seem like they can't get along in the world. That, if we lived in the caveman days, that they, probably be the first ones eaten by the bear. And I think what's critical is to understand that, kind of on a science fiction note, we are among you. That nobody had any idea that I had ASD for 20 years. That's not to say that I didn't have my little quirks. There are things that I've done throughout my career that, it's funny, I've actually leveraged them as strengths, not even realizing that I was doing them. And one of the things that I often find myself doing is repeating something. If there's something that I want to emphasize, there's a point I want to make, I repeat it. And I usually repeat it 2 or 3 times. And, I've found that I was doing it naturally. It wasn't a conscious effort that, a lot of people do that from a conscious perspective. To me, it was just the way to do things. If there's something that's sticking in my mind is important, I repeat it. And it's like I repeat it in my head, and so it comes out of my mouth. And interestingly, as a leader, I found that team members were ultimately, it was sinking in with them, and they would say it back to me at a later date, maybe a week or a month later, they would repeat back to me exactly what I had said to them several times. And I wasn't doing it consciously so that they would absorb it. It's just, to me, as part of my focus, I naturally would repeat it.
Right.
So going back to, how that, how the pandemic and how the work from home environment has affected us, because it's a spectrum, it's dramatically different for different people. I tend to be much more social, or on the social end of that ASD spectrum. But I've been okay. While it's driven me nuts that I can't have water cooler talk, and I can't take somebody and say, hey, let's go have chat over coffee, so that I can get to know you a little better. I've had to schedule water cooler time, and that's actually what I called it, where I do, a 1 hour where I'd make myself available. If you wanted to pop into a Zoom room with me, you could, and we could talk about whatever. It wasn't a one-on-one. It was, hey, let's chat.
Not necessarily about work either.
Right, exactly. In fact, my preference was it wasn't, that was just natural conversation. But there are others, because of having a less social nature, that they absolutely embraced working from home, and loved the fact that, they didn't have to have those noisy environments. I come from a service desk environment, and those can be very noisy because you've got calls coming in constantly, you've got people talking. And, I have some of that challenge with being, when there's background noise, it's hard for me to filter out background noise. And so some people with ASD, embrace the fact that in work from home, they didn't have to deal with that background noise. They didn't have to deal with flickering fluorescent lights, because the way that people with autism spectrum disorder process information can be very different. Their sensory perceptions are different. They may see actually the flicker of a fluorescent light. You may not realize this, but a fluorescent light, while it appears constant to the neurotypical mind, it is constantly flickering. And so, some of us see that flicker. And so there's these different things. And, I've found that, that some of the things, I feel better about working from home. I'm a germaphobe from way before the pandemic. And I love that I don't have to go and touch, a handrail that I know, 1,000 people have touched before me just in the last hour. But, there's things that have been beneficial to those of us on certain aspects of the spectrum and things that have been beneficial to people on the other end. So just like the neurotypical community, the neurodiverse community, some of us love working from home, some of us don't like it as much, and some of us find different aspects.
Yeah. And it goes back, I mean, the model that I work with is the everything DISC model. And half of that spectrum is more social based, half of that is more task based. Half of the up to the top is faster driven, faster paced. Part of it is slower, but there is no difference there. It is just people are different. There's no right or wrong. And it's being able to identify those things, being able to just listen to somebody. And that helps you as a leader, I'm sure, is having your own background with neurodivergency. I'm sure that's helped you become a better leader. Would you agree with that?
I would, and that's not the case for everybody. And here again,
exactly.
This is where we talk about the
again,
spectrum.
Everybody's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my case, what I think back to when I transitioned from being an individual contributor in sales to being a leader in sales, and even when I transitioned from being an individual contributor in IT to being a leader in IT. I've always had certain aspects of my personality that lent themselves to leadership. But I also had aspects of my personality that tended to be very challenging, and things that, some leaders didn't always appreciate. And so, as I've learned to lead, I've also taken on, as I learned to lead, I took direction and correction appropriately. I think back to, I remember one time that, one of my leaders said, in all honesty, he told me, he's like, Doug, you're a very bright guy. Use your powers for good, not for evil. And I remember that almost like, with utmost clarity, almost every day. And so as I approach something, I approach it from, what is the potential outcome? And so that's one of the aspects of my neurodiversity is I always am looking forward to, depending on the options available, sort of risk reward. If this, then what's the projected outcome? And so that's how I've had to teach myself to lead, if you will, is emulate those who came before me that were good leaders, emulate their behaviors, and then also apply my innate ability to look at potential outcomes to actions. And so while I may not feel things the way that the neurotypical community does, what I've learned is through my interactions with the neurotypical community, what the probable outcomes of certain actions are. And so I've learned how to better work within the social context. And it's funny, I think back to when my wife and I got together 27 years ago. I was not a very sociable person. And the only time I was is if I had a drink in my hand. And so, I had to socially lubricate in order to be a social person. But that's changed over time because my wife is a very sociable person, very outgoing, very much an extrovert. And so I learned through her how to be a sociable person. And now when I'm at conferences or what have you, I'm very outgoing. I walk right up to people and, introduce myself and ask them if it's their first time attending. And, then I'll like hook them up with other people because I know I don't have the bandwidth to stay with them during a whole conference, but I introduce them to other people who I know will take them under their wing. And so I've learned how through others, what the benefit of being sociable is. And while it may not be natural to me, it's become part of me.
Mm-hmm. And I've been the recipient of that. You've introduced people to me through that mindset, that direction. And it's one of those great things, because that truly goes back to Dr. Stephen Covey's concept of win-win, of people working together. So
yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit here. What are some things, if we could give a leader, you've had a great deal of success over the years, what is something you might tell a neurotypical leader in working with, whether it's neurotypical or neurodivergent members on their team? What are a couple of tips that you might give them to try and do to become a more powerful leader?
Yeah, and one of the best books I ever read, and I also tend to be a fairly voracious reader, as part of my wanting to consume a topic in its entirety. I love to read constantly. And one of the best books I've ever read on leadership is It's Your Ship by Admiral Abramoff. And It's Your Ship says, whatever you inherit is yours. So you figure out how to make it work. It's easy to sweep things under the rug. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to turn things around, but it's also very rewarding to turn things around. So one of the things that I picked up from that book and have applied is one of the first things that he did as a rear admiral. He went in and he interviewed every single sailor on his ship. And that's, I'm not former military, but I do have a lot of family that's former military. And that's almost unheard of in the military environment. Mm-hmm. Is, it's all chain of command. So, typically the admiral would speak to his lieutenants, and they would speak to their midshipmen. And so, it would be down chain of command, and then, report back to me on what you find. Well, he actually interviewed every single member of his ship when he took over command.
And that can be an awful lot of people too.
Yeah. And that was such a powerful approach, because what it did is it made them understand that he cared. But what he also did is he got their permission in each of those interviews to jot down some things about him. And he didn't ask him about, what's your duty? What do you do on the ship? He asked them about their families. He asked them about their homes. He asked them about, what are the things that you care about? What do you want to do when you get out of the Navy? And these kind of things gave him insight into who they were as people, not as sailors. And so I've always tried to make that a part of how I conduct my business. I would encourage every leader, get to know your team individually, get to understand them, because then you understand what their motivations are. You understand what's important to them. It helps you to design rewards programs that matter. It's easy for us to say, going back to my sales days, you sell so many, X mattresses and you'll get X number of dollars. Great. Okay. That's great. But, maybe dollars isn't my big motivator. Maybe, if you offer me an extra day off, I'll be happier. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
it's so, really interesting, because it's all about finding out what works for different people. And
yeah.
It's so funny, because you're talking in sales. And one of the things I always say is everybody's in sales at one time or another. Okay. You didn't get the job you got because you just walked in and said, hi, I want the job. You got the job because you had to sell yourself on it. Okay. My late wife used to use the term all the time. She didn't know whether she was proposed to or closed. So we're all constantly in some form of sales, and great leaders are great listeners, and they're great sales folks because they listen to what the people need, and they go to fill that need. And that's really powerful.
Yep.
Yeah. So what is something you would like people to know? I mean, this is Autism Acceptance Month. What is something you want the general population to know about this month? Just anything pops to mind. What is it?
So what I want everybody to know is that just because somebody has autism spectrum disorder, and here's where I'll throw out, I already said the most important word in that 3-word diagnosis is spectrum.
Right.
The least important word, and the one that I like the least, and I think that most of the neurodiverse community likes least, is disorder.
Mm-hmm.
It's difference, and I think there's going to come a day when that disorder term is dropped. ASD is just a different way of viewing the world. It's different perceptions. I already mentioned, the way we see things, the way that we hear things, the way that we process things is just different. There's no right or wrong about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I want to come from this is acceptance, and up until a few years ago, April was Autism Awareness Month. Well, okay, great. So you're aware, so the neurotypical community is aware. There's people out there with autism. Okay, they knew that. That's not any great shakes to awareness. Mm-hmm. What is critical in this April is, and this began a few years ago, is acceptance. Accepting that the neurodiverse community exists, that we are, I said it before, we are among you. We're working side by side with you. You just may not know it. There's a lot of people that I've worked with over the years that had no idea. They knew I was a little quirky, but they didn't know, what my diagnosis was.
I've been quirky too in my life, so there.
Yeah. And I kept it secret for 20 years. But now what I'm hoping is that, through my coming out and through others coming out in this April and whenever it is, whether it's April or not, that you accept we are just who we are. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what our diagnosis is, what our diversity or difference is. It's just, we are who we are. We're no different. I'm no different in May than I was in March. I'm the same person. I'm just a little bit more authentic because, to your point, I've made myself vulnerable. I've come out and I've said to the world, hey, this is who I am.
And that's really powerful. So, Doug, this is your second time on the Teamwork Advantage. Hopefully we can get you back another time and talk about more things. And once we're out through this pandemic and how things are starting to go, and check on some more of your accomplishments down the line. I really thank you for your time joining us here today. We've covered a lot when we look at everything. And folks, I want everybody to remember, once a week with the Teamwork Advantage, you get ideas that you can start to implement immediately. And Doug has shared those with us today, whether it's about general leadership or working with the neurodivergent community. Doug has helped us understand and bring awareness. And now it's up to us this month to take acceptance of autism. Once a week, you get ideas that you can act on, and I'm going to challenge you to start acting on those ideas right away. Each week, we bring you a new guest talking about teamwork, leadership, and culture. So until next week, remember, having a good day is just being average. When you listen to the Teamwork Advantage, we know that you are not average. So go out and make today and every day excellent and exceptional. Thanks again, Doug. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Greg.
You've been listening to the Teamwork Advantage with Greg Gregory. Be sure to like, subscribe, and activate the bell icon to be notified of future episodes. To learn more about how Greg can help your organization develop a powerful winning culture, visit TeamsRock.com. That's TeamsRock.com.